cover anything we didn't cover in these 14 verses, that would be good as well. Can I get a volunteer to read Ecclesiastes 7, verses 1 through 14 for us? Ricky, go ahead. Yes, please.
A good name is better than the precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men. And the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter. For my sad countenance, the heart is made better. The heart is of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the songs of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool, that this also is vanity. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reasons. A bribe debases the heart. The end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and profitable to those who see the sun. For wisdom is a defense, as money is a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful, but in the day of adversity, consider. Surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him.
Awesome. Thank you, Rick. All right. Any thoughts? I mean, which of these proverbs from these verses do you find maybe particularly challenging, inspiring, and or confusing? Or just sticks out to you as striking that you just want to talk about? Chase?
The part about don't dwell on, or don't say that the past days are better than these days. Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of funny because you kind of hear that all the time, and as I get old, I'm sure I'll say it too. Like,
yeah.
Oh, I remember the good old days, and he's kind of saying, were they really better than today, I guess?
Yeah.
You don't speak wisely of these things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Rick had a great comment on this last week, just about how, and it was actually reminding me of a comment from a commentary I'd read about this. This thought can also often be a substitute for action, right? It's just like sometimes instead of acting, we're like, well, the things used to be better and easier, and I would have done this then. But almost always, this is what this commentary says by Derek Kidner, almost invariably overlooks the evils that took a different form or vexed a different section of society in those times. That's what you were saying, Rick, that when we look back on the good old days, it wasn't good old days for somebody else, or the evil just was a form that we didn't think was maybe that evil for whatever reason. Maybe we were immature, maybe we were just naive or whatever, or maybe it was just great times for us. And so, yeah, it is a really interesting one. I like that he just says it's not from wisdom that you talk about this. It's just not a sensible thing. And he's like, suffice it to say, like, if you need to figure this out, I'm not going to help you any more than just telling you don't do it, because it's not wise. And that's, it's funny because a lot of times there'll be more explanation in the next line. This one's just like, this one is pretty on the face of it, something you should just know. And I think we do, even when we engage with it. Good. What other proverbs or sections of this do you want to talk about or bring up for talking, Les?
I like verse 12. Wisdom is a shelter, as money is a shelter, but the advantage of knowledge is this, that wisdom preserves the life of its possessor. Mm-hmm. In other words, wisdom, you're going to make better decisions than if you're a fool.
Yeah, for sure, yeah. The wisdom literature has lots of verses like this. They're kind of straightforward like that, right? It's an interesting, and a lot of times, like Job will compare it to plumbing the depths of the earth for jewels and precious metals in Job 28, when on this like praise of wisdom. And so a lot of times it's compared to riches. But it's interesting, this is almost a lower view of wisdom than much of the wisdom literature gives, right? Where wisdom is is better than gold and jewels, better than anything. And so this is one that actually says it's actually equal. And it's an interesting point that's made because you're right that there is a straightforward point where it gives you protection, and you can kind of like good investments, having a savings, an emergency savings can be a protection, right? But it seems like almost part of this is saying, but it only lasts as long as you live. You know, you can't take money with you, and you also don't really take wisdom with you. It helps you in this life, but you know, for me, I don't know, maybe I'm just reading into this, but there's always an undertone, and even in the good, in the helpful like principles like that these things are still kind of tinged or tinted by death. You know, like even just like money only is good. Maybe this is me. Maybe I'm going off far. But I think you're right. There is a really good principle in this that is protective and helpful, and that's one of the good reminders from the proverbial wisdom for sure. I can get off on the deep end of some of these things because I think about them too much. Anything else? Any other proverbs or any other verses I think that you guys want to bring up or talk about? Kathy? Yeah.
It's about being joyful in prosperity, but also consider when you're under adversity.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the verse reminds me of what James was talking about in his lesson about how we don't always understand, and God doesn't intend us to understand everything.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to understand. We just have to trust him.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and it goes with verse 13, right? That what is crooked we cannot make straight, and these kind of thoughts. Consider the work of God. This is part of it. Consider this. And in days of adversity, they present us the opportunity to really consider, because if we were God, we wouldn't have any days of adversity, right? And so days of adversity are built-in reminders that I'm not in control. And if that's the case, then that's a good, healthy reminder, isn't it? And like you said, where it goes is saying, God, it points to this fact that there's something else going on that is bigger than me. And that's the ultimate wrestling of being a human being, right? We think we have all these things figured out. And even it follows right in the heels of what the verse Les point out, right? Where money and wisdom are alike and they protect you. But then there's still hard days where it's like no amount of wisdom can stop the train from hitting you, of just the difficulties of life. And they present us with this, that we don't know what's coming. And so we have to really wrestle with our existence. And on the good days, we just get to enjoy them. On the hard days, we have to spend some time really thinking about it. Yeah, that's one of my favorite verses in the Bible, Ecclesiastes 7:14. Good. Anything else before we move on? Go ahead, Pat. Sorry, I missed you.
I'm not sure how this fits, but verse 2, better to go to a funeral than a wild party, so to speak.
Yeah.
We had a case where we had a dear friend that we visited with often and thought we knew him well. You really don't know him until you go to their funeral, and you hear everything good about that person. Everything we did that was, knowing for 50 years, we didn't know about. So it's better to go to a funeral and hear all that good stuff.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective. Yeah, we talked about this some last week too. There is more to be taken to heart from the hard things and the hard truths of life. And like to your point, we just learn more through that than we do from happiness. That pairs well with the end of this section that Kathy pointed out, where the hard days have a lot of value involved in them, but it's not necessarily intrinsic. You have to seek it out. You have to choose to go to the funeral. You have to wade through the hard emotions that it brings up and the sadness and the grief, but there's so much benefit from it. Whereas going to a party and feasting, it's like, man, it feels great, it's nice, it's happy, but that's about it. And you need that too, right? We need both. Daryl? But I think that's a really good point to bring up. Then we'll move on to the next section after this.
Verse 5, mine's NIV, but it says, it is better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than listen to the song of a fool.
Yep.
And now we get all these contrasts between being a fool and having wisdom. But what's interesting is that you have enough humility to somebody who's rebuking you, kind of, telling you, hey, listen, you need to change, and you need to have enough humility to listen to that and realize it's wisdom, and take it.
Yeah.
Not be prideful.
Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, it's such a skill to learn how to hear rebuke and to lean into it enough to change. That's really challenging, but it is the secret. It is the kind of the key to true growth, continual growth. If you can hear rebukes and take them to heart, Good. All right, let's move on. Let's pick up in verse 15 and read. just read to the end of the chapter. I guess I want to read 15 through 29 for us. Ecclesiastes 7, 15 through 29. Les, go ahead, please.
In this meaningless life of mine, I have seen both of these. A righteous man perishing in his righteousness, and a wicked man living long in his wickedness. Do not be over-righteous, neither be over-wise. Why destroy yourself? Do not be over-wicked, and do not be a fool. Why die before your time? It is good to grasp the one and not let go of the other. The man who fears God will avoid all extremes. Wisdom makes one wise man more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. There is not a righteous man on earth who does what is right and never sins. Do not pay attention to every word people say, or you may hear your servant cursing you. For you know in your heart that many times you yourself have cursed others. All this I tested by wisdom, and I said, I am determined to be wise, but this was beyond me. Whatever wisdom may be, it is far off and most profound. Who can discover it? So I turned my mind to understand, to investigate, and to search out wisdom and the scheme of things, and to understand the stupidity of wickedness and the madness of folly. I find more better than death the woman who is snared, whose heart is a trap and whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God will escape her, and the sinner she will ensnare. Look, says the teacher, this is what I have discovered. Adding one thing to another to discover the scheme of things, while I was still searching but not finding. I found one upright man among 1,000, but not one upright woman among them all. This only I have found. God made mankind upright, but men have gone in search of many schemes.
Thanks, Les. All right. So this is a perplexing section to start off with, verses 15 through 19. It tells us not to be overly wise. Also, what else? Not to be overly wise and not to be overly what? Wicked. What else? Righteous. Not be overly righteous. So when he talks, I should have thrown righteous up there with wise, because the negative ones, don't be overly wicked. Okay, we get that can be easy to understand. I don't want to be wicked, right? That's especially we're in a church building, we're in a Bible class. I think safely we can say none of us desire to be wicked in here. I hope I can paint that broad brush with us. But this concept, don't be overly wise or overly righteous, why does he gives a reason. Why does he say this, and what does it mean to this encouragement? Don't be overly wise. Don't be overly righteous. What's his reasoning, and what does this all mean? Don't ruin yourself. See, that's like that just kind of kicks the ball down a little further, doesn't it? Doesn't really answer our question before us. Gene?
Well, maybe he's not talking about within our relationship with God. Maybe he's talking about don't be overly wise, don't be overly righteous in your relationship with your fellow man.
Interesting. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting, because we can talk a lot. We've been talking a lot about life bounded by the horizons of this world. As he puts it, life under the sun. So if we put in those limitations, there might actually be some downfall to being overly righteous, right? If that's all we are. Yeah, that's a good insight. We'll talk more about that. Rick, and then Todd, and then Les.
The Apostle Paul talks about take heed lest you fall.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's talking about having an attitude of being, I've succeeded in life. I'm so good. I'm so right.
Yeah.
No matter what you do, pal, you're not going to exceed what I've accomplished.
Yeah.
He's talking about having a humble attitude towards, even if you're good, just hold it, pal. Just keep on being good. Don't worry about, and be good to everybody, because at some point you might,
Yeah.
Old uncle said you might meet the person that on your way up, on the way down.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No, I think there is. I think there's some balance in this verse, right? Balance is definitely struck here. And that's an interesting, there is kind of like, hey, hold on to both of these things, which is fascinating encouragement to find in wisdom. But I think you're right. There is balancing involved in this. Todd?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it's good that we want to strive to be as righteous as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be as good as possible. But I think the idea here is not to be a know-it-all that I know everything, and you're going to fall if you are somebody like that. I think that's the idea. Having pride, and I cannot be wrong. That's the idea, I think, here.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, it's certainly true, right? Where these pursuits, if we think righteousness can be attained, then if we're in that pursuit, we're going to fall, right? For sure. Chase and Sam, we'll get your comments too. This is a good little.
Verse 18 to me summarizes 15 through 19 when it says, I mean, it's very direct. The man who fears God, and we've seen that many times, is very important, will avoid all extremes. The God-fearing person will avoid both extreme legalism and libertyism and lead a balanced, truly righteous and wise life.
Yeah.
Balance is important.
Yeah, I think you're right. That there is a big wisdom isn't interested in a lot of this balance you're talking about. Good. Chase and Sam, what do you guys have? What do you think?
I see a contrast in where it says, the righteous man, he perishes in his righteousness, but the wicked man who prolongs his life in his wickedness.
Yeah.
Like, who's prolonging the wicked man's life?
Yeah.
And then you go down a little bit farther, and it says, don't be excessively wicked. Why should you die before your time? That's a bit different than what you just said earlier. Kind of like, is Satan prolonging the wicked man's life, but at the end, God's going to cut you down, so maybe that's the ending thought there. The two contrast or kind of brush up against each other a bit.
Yeah. No, that's a really astute observation. That's why these verses they're certainly supposed to cause us to think. Like, I think that's the point of this argument. It's very rhetorical, and I think a lot of us we're all in the ballpark getting the point. But I think he says these opposite truths because they make us really think. Like, okay, well, there's a Psalm 73 talks about, the Psalm of Asaph says, I saw the wicked man prospering and my foot almost slipped. I think we can all agree there's a truth where some people will prosper by their wickedness. I think Ecclesiastes actually talk about that in chapter 5 or 6 as well. So we can see that going on. People who, because of their wickedness, actually get a lot of gain from it, right? But then the other truth is that I think you're right, that wickedness most of the time actually doesn't succeed. A lot of time it tosses your life down the drain. But some people prosper by the wickedness, and those are the ones that stick out to us. But the ones that fail, we think, oh yeah, well, they got what they deserved, and of course their life ended like that. I'm not saying we should think like that. Let me be clear. That's a pretty callous thought, but it also is true. And so I think there is this interesting thing where, in the observation of wickedness, it's like, well, sometimes, occasionally people really prosper, and that is so wrong. It really challenges how I should live my life, possibly, if I'm observing it. But in general, the rule is it's not going to prosper you. I think that's how I take that. Does that make sense?
Life. But to your point, there's another great part where it says the Lord allows the wicked to prosper, to bless others, to... I think that's a proverb. I don't remember.
I don't know. I'm not familiar with that. That's what, but it is? Yeah. Hey, Sam, go ahead. What did you have?
Yeah, I've wrestled with the verse about being overly righteous. I think, there's got to be a clue in, the destruction element. First of all, what would over righteousness look like?
Yeah.
And how might it lead to destruction? And I could just think of, a theoretical circumstance of being overtly righteous. Say in Jesus' time, you have, persecution, which is, deadly.
Yeah.
Sort of find that balance of because Jesus and the disciples, they were bold, but they weren't moving, irrationally. They were covering their tracks, and sometimes Jesus would go out of his way to avoid certain things. I think being overtly righteous to the point of martyrdom, I could just speak to these people right now, or these people who are about to stone me, I could just preach the gospel right here.
Yeah.
Lord, I'm righteous. I won't hold my tongue. I think, I don't know, I just have to go there because the explanation that's been given previously, I can see where that's coming from of being overtly righteous is just being righteous and then bragging about it. But I don't think that's righteous. I think that's going into haughtiness, which is abominable. So I have to consider both.
Sure.
Is there an overt righteousness that we ought to consider not pushing to that extreme? And then it sums it up with it's good that you grasp these, and if you trust in God and you take in all the proverbial wisdom, you'll escape both those extremes. So I think just interesting to look at from both angles.
Yeah, that's such an interesting counterpoint to some. There's something in here where it reminds me of Jesus saying you must be wise as serpents, as gentle as doves. Or in Luke 16, when he has a whole parable about the unrighteous steward. You guys remember that parable? I mean, like, what am I supposed to do with this, Lord? Like, he was good because he kind of wheeled and dealed? Like, is that what I'm supposed to learn? And Jesus says the sons of darkness are more shrewd than the sons of light. Well, that's interesting. And I would say, you can look at this in terms of, we can talk, okay, don't crucify me for this. But you can look at this in terms of like the general kind of observations we have when kids are in public school or homeschooled or private school, all these things. The sheltering that comes. And there's so much good from sheltering kids, right? It's like a good thing to do. It's a parent's job to keep their kids safe. And then also, but sometimes along with that, not all of the street smarts or the way to actually operate in the world come along with that. Sometimes protecting kids from too much. And this is where I don't envy I'm going to be there at some point, Lord willing, here in the future, but I don't envy the process of figuring that out. That's a really hard thing, okay? So I'm not trying to criticize either side unduly. But we can see that, I think, it happens, right? Where the people who lived there can kind of come a naiveness or a unreality, or that's not a word, but like a lack of kind of reality from these things. And I don't know if that's what he's saying. And this guy's to your point, Dad, where he talks about, maybe this is just kind of talking about our relationships first and foremost, where we're like, but again, it is a challenging section of verses. I mean, to all these points, like the balance struck in the middle might be what we have to hold on to, where there is kind of keeping our eyes open to the options, which sounds horrible to say when it's wickedness being one of the options or foolishness. This is a perplexing verse. And I think the thoughtful, I think to me the bottom line is that a lot of what the preacher is doing in this whole book is saying, look, like the way you make decisions and the thought processes that go into it, they can't be too simple. And to me, maybe if that's the only kind of conclusion we get from this, that's a really valid lesson. That's your point, Les, that there has to be balance. We have to consider and understand that there is a lot going on in any decision that gets made. And when you start to go into like the laws of the land even, or like so many of the laws of God, there's like Christians interpret laws differently. I have to submit to the government. Well, does that mean I can't go 1 mile per hour over the speed limit? Some people will take their righteousness to a point where it says, I never speed. And the people who do that, I say, good for you. I mean, that's a really commendable way to like understand the law of God and the law of the land. But I think some of us, we would say, we're like, well, I don't care about speed limits, or 5 over is the same as the same to me. I'll cut someone off in an intersection, right? All these sorts of things that may or may not have happened today, but it's like these are the ways that we look at these things. It's like when we really start to consider and meditate upon each specific instance of life, there has to come some thought with this, right? Because it's just like, well, this is what it says, this is what I'm going to do. Then sometimes there needs to be a thoughtfulness in how these things, everything's really layered and complex. And maybe that's just a cop-out to this. Go ahead, Judy, and then I think we need to move on if that's all right.
Well, like the wickedness of, the rich man here, and for instance, in the New Testament talks about the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man had all, and he was evil, and he had all his wealth, and he was well known, and then poor little Lazarus had nothing, and he lived a miserable life. But when they both died, Lazarus went to his father's bosom, and he was comforted, and the rich man went to a bad place. And sometimes life on this planet is not easy.
Yeah.
Sometimes bad things happen to people. But as long as you try to strive and to serve God and do what he asks, God never promised that we're going to live in Garden of Eden forever.
Yeah.
Things are hard wherever we live.
Yeah.
But as long as we serve God to the best of our abilities, he will bless us in the end, and our place is in heaven.
Yeah.
And regardless of what situation we are in, our eyes is toward heaven. And like I said, life here is not easy. We might have persecution, we might be hungry, we might be homeless, we might have problems. Life is not easy. But as long as we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus and the rewards that he promised us, that's all we have to hope for.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, to your point, like, his conclusion of this whole book is going to be what? Ecclesiastes 12. Yeah, so to your point, like, this has to fit into that point you just made. And the question is going to be, I'll be honest with you, I don't have the greatest of answer to how to wrestle out all of this. To me, this is a really kind of, he's saying a really big thing, and I'm not sure if I get small points out of it. But I think the ultimate point is kind of for those of us, for people on either side. First of all, this verse, I think, is meant to shake us out of our rut that we're in, with how we view my righteousness or my wickedness, my foolishness, my wisdom, and to make sure that we're really being mindful that there are a lot of options in all of this. And we have to be, we can't be too lazy or too complacent in how we approach things. But I think there also is in this kind of like you said, a reality to how life's going to be, and life demands that we don't just have a Band-Aid for everything. Not every solution is a Band-Aid. Not every solution says, well, this is it, you know. I just follow the speed limit no matter what. And it's like, well, my wife's in labor. Am I going to be the one driving 25 miles? Oh, it's a school zone right now. It's 20 miles per hour, honey. We have to drive really slow. And we'll just pay the ticket. You know, that's, you know, like, if I get, whatever. I'm saying, like, there are kind of, we have to really consider these things, I think. And maybe, I don't know, maybe that's not a satisfying answer, but I think the point of this is to really be uncomfortable to some extent and try and shake us into seeing the balance that has to be struck to live 80, 90 years, Lord willing, in this world to make it through. I don't know if that's a cop-out, but that's kind of where I end up with meditating on these verses. Rick, go ahead. We can move on after this. I know this is a heavy section.
There's just so much to, you know, you mentioned about when little Joanne starts to grow up and you start thinking about school and stuff like that. I had a conversation with my oldest daughter after Hilda passed away. And, you know, I thought we were doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. And she made a statement of, you know, Dad, in this particular instance, this situation, might have been overprotecting her. Mm. However, as time went on, she still had to learn to deal with it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's where that godly, you know, back to what Todd said, and when he brought out, here's the end of the conclusion.
Yeah.
Fear God and keep His commandments. So after everything you do, and it may go sideways, and it will.
Yeah.
And it may be good, and it will.
Yeah.
Either and or.
Yeah.
Keep your eye on the cross, like Judy said.
Yeah.
And even with that, sometimes it's like you're faced with things and situations. You go, I see the cross, but it's sure foggy.
Yeah, it's far away.
You know.
Yeah.
And you're struggling, you're battling, and we're praying for each other, and we're loving each other, and we're going through all this stuff and things, and we're all over the place.
Yeah.
But without God and His truths and His people,
yeah,
man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe one more thing to say about this. I know I keep saying move on, but maybe the conclusion of this is if you're looking at life without God in it, then this is kind of what you're left with, isn't it? Like, this is your best effort. If there is no God, if like being moral or kind of being secular and trying to find morals secularly, this is kind of your best wisdom you can find. Well, I don't want to be overly righteous because I see those people, and that's a tough road. I also don't want to be overly wicked, to Chase's point, because most people perish. Maybe some prosper, but that's not a good road either. And so maybe I just want to try. Maybe if I'm living without God, I'll try and ride the line, right? I'll try and ride it because I'll get the best of both worlds from that and avoid the worst of both. And I think to the point we're making, these verses fail in the Christian worldview. To your point, Sam, like these really do fail in a Christian worldview. We can apply them, right? Maybe they mean don't think you can be righteous on your own. Maybe that's what it means. But I think maybe the point is that it is kind of striking at if you don't have God as the backbone to your morals, then you're kind of left figuring things out like this. Well, I don't want to be too righteous, don't want to be too foolish, don't want to be too wise, don't want to be too wicked, but I want a good blend of all those to live like the cosmopolitan, down the middle, average life. And that's the best we have without God. That's my conclusion on this, all right? That's where I'm at right now. Ask me next week, I'll change it. But I think that's the best to get out of this. I do want to move on, regardless of all this. As he goes on, what advice does he start to share in verses 20 through 22? How would you sum up this advice, or what does he say? What's the advice he gives? Particularly in the middle of it, verse 21. What's the advice in verse 21?
Take seriously of your word.
Yeah, don't take to heart all the things people say, lest what?
Cursing.
Yeah, you hear someone cursing you. Yeah. So how do we follow this advice? Firstly, how do we follow this advice? Because it is good advice, right? So how do we follow? What's the first thing he says? Don't take to heart all the things you hear people say. What does that look like?
It sounds like he's just saying don't be overly sensitive.
Yeah. I think there is a sensitivity part of this, right, Rick?
I think there's a judgment thing. When you hear somebody say something, Christian, you go, ooh, well, that don't sound very good.
Yeah.
And if you hear your brother say something, and you go, and then if it's something doctrinally, you talk about it.
Sure. Yeah. There are things that are worth talking about.
But there's a lot of times you hear things and you see things that people say and you go, whoa.
Yeah. And what's the point he adds in verse 22 to this, right?
Yeah.
What's he say to kind of make your point? You've done it yourself.
Yeah,
I mean, you've
exactly.
ever said something, you're like,
Yeah.
I should not have said that.
Right.
Or you say, and you're like, yeah, I said that, and someone brings it up, you're like, oh, that got back to that person. You're like, maybe, and then you're like, maybe I shouldn't have said that, only because I got caught. But that's why, I'm not commending it, but I'm saying I think this is a common human experience because we are short-sighted, and like he's pointing out, we've taken part in this. It's interesting, when I ask this question, what counterpoint what might we make to that advice? He's kind of just being flippant, like, well, it just happens, right? People curse each other, people say things they shouldn't. And that's part of what I was trying to get at with bringing this up, to your point, Rick, like, people say all sorts of this And I think this is maybe this is because I'm the youngest child, one of the things I struggle with is just like, I want to believe everybody all the time. My brother Jason used to tell me, when I get home from school and I tell him stories, he'd say, Ben, all your friends are liars. Don't listen to any of them. That's what he always told me. And I never believed him. But it's like I have this desire to believe people. And part of the wisdom here is just people are people, and people say all sorts of things all the time. And you got to take that to heart and remember that. Because I've also said things that I didn't even mean or didn't know. When I said them, they weren't, this comes, in religious context, this takes on a whole other meaning to your point where you have to really ponder, like the Bereans, compare and contrast to what God has to say. But I think there is something in here that it can be almost flippant, like this is just how the world works. And I think there's an interesting difficulty in that. Cass?
I think the extreme that we need to avoid in verse 22 is hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Because hypocrisy is like, everybody does it, obviously, but it can also be taken to extreme levels, and
Yeah. And so to your point, Gene, like there's, the end result is not being overly sensitive, because we know that we've said things, and we know everybody says things, but the path to get there is, I think, remembering that people are people, and that all have failings and such. Terry, I want to hear what you have to say too, because I know, and John as well.
One thing I think about as well is when people say something, it can, if you hear it later, it can often not be the exact thing that was said.
What?
The intent may not be there. I mean, things get blown out. And even if you just hear it. So really, you know, you don't need to spend a lot of time, unless it hits home where you're like, they have a valid point. That is something maybe I need to work on.
A rebuke of the wise, maybe, to Daryl's point earlier. Yeah. I mean, you might not hear all the context even. John, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, this might be a silly example, but big brother Xander was pitching in a ball game, and noticed the collegiate coach, he walked a batter, a collegiate coach walked out to the mound, and man, I could read his lips. I couldn't believe all the cursing and blah, blah, blah. And there was a message in there too, right? And I asked Xander how he felt about that after the ball game, and he goes, "Oh, you just have to
filter out all of the cursing and listen to the message. And it says, I got the message, don't walk batters, it leads to runs.
Yeah.
But I thought, that's important, kind of what Gene's saying, don't be thin-skinned. And if you focus on the cursing too, you might miss the message. And so there could be a really good message in there, like don't walk batters, right?
Yeah. I think it's a great analogy for this. I mean, not analogy, that's the application of this. Yeah, I think that's all spot on. And the only other counterpoint to this I wanted to bring up, why I asked this question is, we also can't be flippant with the fact that this happens, right? Just because we do curse others, this verse is not saying, well, that's just how it is, like, too bad. I know none of us read it that way, but I think it's important to, he's making an observation about how the world is, and it's generally true. This is how it is so often. And it comes right after verse 20, right? Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. This comes right in context of that. Remember that too, Oh, this person is fallen and sinful just like me. They probably shouldn't have said that. And if we could have that mindset, be like, well, those words didn't need to be said. I'm just going to move on. All these reminders keep us straight ahead. We need to move on though. Look at verse 23. He goes on to say, he makes this admission in verse 23. He says, all this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but what? What does he end that with? It's far from me. That which has been is far off and deep, very deep. Who can find it out? This admission starts to change maybe the way we read some of this. I don't think this comes out of maybe he could have put this anywhere in the book of Ecclesiastes, right? He put it here. And maybe does this change some of the ways we read? Don't be overly wise, don't be overly wicked, don't be overly righteous, don't be overly foolish. Or this even about this kind of almost careless, like everyone curses people sometimes, so I guess that's just the way it is. It almost, these are some of the most difficult sayings. We're about to read another difficult saying in Ecclesiastes in the very next verses. Don't forget that. All this section is full of some of the more difficult sayings that almost the preacher's saying, these are getting to the end of my wisdom, but they're true. As we read them, we're all like, yeah, these are true. And I think as part of this chapter makes it so hard is we're getting to these points where it's like, there are things that are so broken in this world. There's no one righteous who always does good. And since that's the case, no wisdom can be applied 100% of the time. And no principle is always true. No maxim is just like, yep, that's unsinkable, bulletproof. No wisdom is foolproof, literally, right? And I think that as the preacher looks at this, he's like, I've spent my life trying to learn all this wisdom, and at the end of the day, this is the best I can say. That's it. And I think sometimes what Ecclesiastes does, he's this critic, and he's kind of cynical sometimes. Man, this is hard, it's bleak. But he's reminding us at the heart of this that he's trying to get to these very true existential parts of life, but reminding us even there that we have to, where he's going to end it, fear God and keep his commandments. And if we're trying to have wisdom without that, then these things, there is no wisdom to answer all these questions if God isn't involved. Our secular wisdom will fail. Life bounded by these horizons, it's always going to fail. You can't have the right answer for every question. You just can't. You're not going to. And that may be depressing, but it's true. And so if we're living and the preacher's trying to give us wisdom, he's like, okay, I'm taking God out of this. Here's the best wisdom you can have without God. And he's like, I tried and I couldn't do it. That's kind of what I think he's saying here. And so some of these hard sayings are like, I don't know what it means. I think maybe the preacher would say, yeah, I don't necessarily know all this means either. But if you don't fear God, if there's no God to fear, then this is the best we have. And I think that's the point he's driving at in this whole book, is to make us realize that if there really is no God, or if we're living as if there is no God, that's a really scary place to be. A lot of questions, not a lot of answers. And there's a lot of gaps. There'll always be a lot of gaps that God intends to fill that will never get filled without him. That, I think, is the point he's driving at and leaving it for us to make that conclusion. That's a great place to end this class, but I do want to ask this last question, maybe spend a minute or two, maybe we can talk about this next time. How are the preacher's words about men and women in this last section to be understood? Yeah, it's not a very kind thing about women, he says, right? One man among 1,000 I have found, but none among women. I think a good criticism is that's a bad, maybe if the sampling process wasn't great for this wisdom, right? If you're looking for 1,000 women, maybe that's why I didn't find one, This also is not, I don't think, in verse 20 he says, there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. And in this verse he says, this is what I've found. And so maybe you can start to criticize the preacher here. Listen, these are hard verses. And maybe if you take even a step further back and say, this is a man talking about his interactions with women. And maybe if this book was written by a woman, she would say the same thing about men. And maybe the truth is that as we seek out these relationships, that there is a lot of failure in relationships between men and women as we seek out that intimate relationship that is different than all others. And so there's a lot of, because there's so much opportunity for success, there's even greater opportunity for failure. It makes it even harder to find someone of the opposite gender or sex that is worthwhile, because you get burned so many times. These are all some of my best thoughts on this. Mike, what do you?
You also have to take into consideration what he was looking for at the time.
Yeah.
He found all these, exactly what he was looking for, though.
Yeah. Yeah, he talks about there's a woman whose heart is snares and fetters, right? And it sounds like he may have escaped her. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken, right? This reminds me of Proverbs. That I looked out my lattice in my window, and what did I see? The foolish man going down towards the house that led towards death. I think part of the wisdom here is there is so much difficulty in finding the one, in a sense. You want to put it that way. I'm not an advocate of the soulmate theory, but I do think in finding someone who you can tie yourself to for the rest of your life, that's a hard proposition. And maybe he's putting on the mantle, or maybe this is Solomon's wisdom again. If Solomon really did have 1,000 women in his life, and maybe there really wasn't one in Solomon's court that was the one. And maybe part of the problem is that there was 1,000, and so none of them were the right one. Some of those times that truth gets made in the doing of things the right way. Does that make sense? Where you find there's too much to say here, but it is a challenging verse. But I think, those are some of my best little inklings for it. We have to end here. If we want to talk about this more next week, we certainly can. I will not avoid this topic because these are verses in the Bible. I don't want to leave us answerless, but I intended to have more time. I really was not trying to shorten this discussion, but we do have to end it. Appreciate you all. That's where we're going to wrap up tonight.